What's up YouTube? Welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be dealing with wiring in our MS3Pro EVO into our Super Beetle. And we're going to get right into it today. The first step in the process is actually going to be taking our wiring harness from the single overhead cam EGA 251 motor, and we're going to basically figure out that harness, label the connectors that we need, take out the things we do not, and then merge it into our Mega Square MS3, our AMP EFI universal harnesses. And in this process, I'll also show you how I determined my different pinouts, how I did my grounding schemes, how I included sensors, and how I use some of the different analog inputs for my own purposes. So tune in and we're going to get right into it. So like I was saying, we're going to start by putting labels on all the connectors that we know we're going to need. And I guess I kind of jumped ahead, but what I also did kind of off camera was I printed out the chart that they provide, as in DIY Autotune and AMP EFI provide for the pinout for the ECU. Let me show you. Yeah, so this little cut sheet actually comes with a computer that gives you the pinout, but I went online and actually printed it out for myself so I could go through and mark which ones I'm going to need in my install. And basically I already have kind of a shortcut for what pins on the ECU I'm going to be using, and I'll just need to match those up with what pins on the engine harness that I need. So again, I'm going to go through, label everything that I need, you know, knock sensor, crank sensor, cam sensor, ignition coil, throttle position sensor. We're not going to use the map. We will use the idle air control valve, solenoid, injectors, etc. So we're going to label those all. Then we'll take the harness off of the motor. We'll kind of cut it open, take out what we don't need. We'll add in the things we do need, as far as the fuel pressure sensor, the oil pressure sensor, the O2 sensor, and actually I think that's all we really need to add for now. Exactly. So we're going to start by splicing down, or I guess parsing down our original engine harness. Alright, so now that we have the harness all laid out and all the connectors labeled so we know what we're doing, you can kind of do this a lot of different ways. The end goal is all the same. I'm going to take off the connectors and the wires that I don't need, and I'm going to identify all the wires and connectors that I do need, and figure out exactly how I'm going to make those into the MS3Pro wiring harness. So what I decided is I'm going to start with this is just a general, so I have the wiring diagram for the Subaru. It's kind of cool because I actually realized I had the harness Subaru tag on here, so I was able to figure out exactly what the heads were off of, which was a 2003 Impreza RS. So that's kind of cool. So what I'm going to do is, now that I have all my connectors, I'm going to just identify everything based on the wiring diagrams, possibly label everything that I need. But the end goal is going to be to remove the stock Subaru. These are kind of like the main connectors that interface for the Subaru. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to repurpose what I need and replace these with bulkhead connectors on this end, and then the other side of the bulkhead connector will be directly to the universal harness for the MS3 Pro. So that'll reduce a lot of the crimping I need to do, and it'll also, so that'll in turn, just by default, make it more reliable, because the least amount of connections is the best amount of connections for wiring, at least from my experience. And again, by no means am I any expert. So with the combination of the Subaru wiring harness diagrams, as well as I have my laptop out with all of the MS3 Pro EVO wiring diagrams, are actually really, really useful. They have very useful ones for the power ground fuel, for all of the kind of standard sensors, which is knock sensor, coolant temp, manifold, air temperature, throttle position, map sensor. If you were going to do a aftermarket map sensor, I'm going to use the map sensor directly on the ECU. So we're gonna go through here and just start probing everything out and kind of get our bearings with what every wire does in this harness, and then we'll know what we can delete and what we need to, you know, make connections with our computer. So I just noticed actually that I confused my injectors with my cam sensor, so it's good that I'm doing this. Alright, so now I'm at the point where I'm just figuring out what each wire is at these plugs, because essentially this is what I'm going to be interfacing with the ECU to. Alright, so we just got through mapping out where every wire is and every connector. It was actually a lot easier than I expected, which is good news. And the way Subaru wired things like the injectors and the sensor grounds and things actually align exactly with the MS3Pro EVO wiring schematics, so that's really good. Made it a lot easier. So now what we're going to do is we're actually going to start opening some of the harness up and removing the things that we don't need. In the meantime, the only thing that we couldn't figure out is just exactly what the pins are for the idle air control valve. Technically, I mean, essentially it's 6 wires that go to it. 2 of them are taps, and the other 4 of them are basically wires for the windings for the motor, for the stepper motor that's used in there. Alright, it's a new day here, so now what we're going to start doing is pulling out any wiring and connectors that we don't need. And we'll use the wiring diagram, and we'll use our bulkhead connectors as a way to kind of figure out exactly what pins are useless to us. And the reason I'm keeping the ones that I want still in the connector is it's just an easy way to keep things organized and know exactly what the wires are doing, because I can use this pin out as my guide. So one thing I want to show you guys up close is, so see like here, I'm removing this old connector, and whatever it was, it shared a power source with my fuel injectors. So what I'm doing is I'm tracing it back, and all of these are power sources for the fuel injectors. So I believe in here is where the splice happens. So I'm going to try to cleanly disconnect it and pull this wire completely out of the loom. Alright, so now that we get all the useless wires and connectors out of the harness, the next thing we're going to want to do is route in our additional sensors, which will be our fuel pressure, our oil pressure, and our intake ambient air temperature. So we'll actually splice those into the wires that we have, because we have a 5-volt reference and we have the sensor return, and we're going to use 2 of the analog inputs for the fuel pressure. I guess it'll be 3. One for the fuel pressure, the analog inputs for the fuel pressure, the oil pressure, and then we'll use the air temperature input for our GM intake air temperature sensor. So we'll need to add in about 6 wires to this harness, and then we'll be able to close it all back up, connect it to our bulkhead connectors, and put it on the car. Alright, so we're finally back at it today. We had quite a delay just waiting for a lot of different parts between our crimp tool and our different connectors. So what I'm going to be showing you here is how we actually splice into the engine harness with what we need for our new wiring. So that will be the fuel pressure sensor, the oil pressure sensor, our air fuel ratio sensor, or oxygen sensor, and our intake air temperature sensor, which we're going to mount into the intercooler. And basically how we're going to splice these wires in is all the same across the board. And so I'm actually going to steal what I've seen a lot of our Australian automotive favorites using. I've watched Haltech, and if you guys watch, if you watch Mighty Car Mods or Skid Factory, all of these, they really highly suggest these open barrel splice crimps. I believe that's what they're called. And essentially what these are, I can show you one up close. And I really suggest watching a video from Haltech or from Turbo Yoda on Skid Factory, because they are very in-depth on how to use these connectors, and this is actually my first time using them. But essentially what you have is this small, let's see, this little crimp here. It's gonna be very difficult to see, of course. There we go. And so what happens is you feed the wires in and you crimp it down on it. It's pretty straightforward. And then what's interesting is I actually noticed it's actually what they use factory in the Subaru harness as I started splicing things up. So I'm actually really happy that I chose to use these connectors, because it's gonna end up being a factory type installation. And the only other really thing you need for these is one of these open barrel splice crimp tools. And this is actually created a lot of the delay. I thought this was going to be a lot easier to find than it was. I ended up getting it through O'Reilly's and had to do a ship to the store situation, because it really wasn't being carried anywhere between any of the, your local auto parts stores, or even like Home Depot, Northern Tool. I checked them all out, and unfortunately it took a little while to get this. So we have our crimp tool, and what I'm going to go through now is showing you how I splice in all of our sensor grounds into the common ground, I guess the common ground splice that's already here on the engine harness. I'm going to show you how I run the lines for where I plan on the where the sensors are going to be. I'm obviously going to add a little extra just to be safe. And then from there, we're going to re-seal up this harness. I know I mentioned before that I wanted to use the Raychem, and we do have the heat shrink, but unfortunately, it's going to basically take me dismantling the whole harness to be able to put the Raychem on. So for now, just to get the harness in the car and start getting through going through our electric system, we're just gonna resheath it with similar material that Subaru uses and just get it right back in the car as quick as possible, so that we can move on to, some of our final checks, doing our vacuum lines and getting the car started. Oh, one other thing I want to mention is both the Raychem DR25 heat shrink as well as these open barrel splice crimps. I got them all straight from TE Connectivity. I'm familiar with them just from my professional career, and they're just a really solid company. They shipped these within like 2 days of me ordering them. They were at the door. So the only thing you really need to know about these crimps is that most commonly they're not actually they're not specified by wire gauge. They actually use what they call CMA, which I think is circular metal area. And like for instance, this one has a range of 600 to 3000 CMA is what you can crimp in here. So what I'm going to do real quickly is just jot down what CMA is for each wire gauge, so I can make sure that I'm using the correct crimps, because I got a lot of different ones. I'm planning on using these, on a lot of projects. So I got all the different sizes, and I just want to make sure I'm using the best crimp for the wires that I'm merging together. So I actually misspoke about the O2 sensor. That wiring comes from the actual gauge. So we will be wiring that outside of the engine harness. So what I'll be showing you is the intake air temperature and the fuel and oil pressure sensors, and how we merge those into this engine harness. Okay, so now you can see what we've done is essentially we've ran, and this is obviously with excess, but these are for our fuel pressure and our oil pressure sensors, and we have 2 signal wires, and we have 1 power, 1 ground. And what we're going to do is for the 2 sensors, we're actually going to share a common power and a common ground, just so there's less wires that need to be run through the whole harness. For the intake air temperature sensor, it only has a power and a signal wire, so we ran those separate. And essentially what we'll need to do next is we'll take the powers and the ground wires and we'll splice them into what currently exists in the Subaru harness for power and ground. And the signal wires will all return to the bulkhead connector, where we'll splice in to go directly to the computer. Alright, so we're going to start by splicing all our sensor grounds together. So what that is it's going to be 1 common ground for the oil and fuel pressure sensor. And we're going to splice that into our existing grounds for what appears to be our coolant temperature sensor, our throttle position sensor, and... oh, actually that's it. Coolant temperature and throttle position, and then we have 1 return back to the connector. So what I'm going to do, you can see right here, it's actually this bundle of black. Let's see if I can separate this. It's this bundle right here of black and red wires. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to splice in my sensor return for the oil and fuel into this already made, and I'm going to kind of clean it up because it's a little sloppy right now. so our camera actually died in the middle of just trimming these wires back. So I just want to show you again. We basically trimmed the sensor ground, which is going to be a shared ground for our oil and our fuel pressure sensor, as well as trimming back the what Subaru has is kind of the factory grounds, which are for the throttle position sensor, I believe. No, yeah, the throttle position sensor and the coolant temperature sensor. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take these 4 wires and we're going to crimp them all together, and we're going to be sure to use heat shrink at the crimp location and kind of a bigger piece to capture all the wires for strain relief. And like I was saying, these crimp connectors are based on cross-sectional metal area. So I did the math real quick. We have 4 18 gauge wires, which comes up to about the CMA for 4 of them, I think, was around 6,400. So we're going to go with one of these guys that goes from 3,000 to 7,000 CMA. So we'll try to get these all even so we don't miss one this time. Okay. And this guy here. Perfect. All 3. There we go. We have all 4 crimped, very secure. Now what we'll do, we'll slide some heat shrink over that joint just to make sure that there's no issues. I'm going to trim back a little extra wire here just to be safe so nothing pokes out. There we go, trim some of that back. Quick little heat shrink. Now we'll slide our bigger piece over just to cover all these wires for safety. So now we're going to go through our power wires. So it's going to be 4 crimps put all together. And then the last thing we'll need to do is just go to our power and ground at the end of this chain that we have, where the fuel and pressure sensor, the fuel and oil pressure sensors will be. And we're actually going to tee these off so that each of them have their own branch for the power and ground. And obviously they're going to have individual signal wires all the way back to the connector because we can't mix those. And we got another solid one. Great. So now we will heat shrink and call it done. Alright, so we're going to wrap the main part of this harness up again, and we're actually going to put it in the car and figure out exactly where we need to make any of our sensor lines end, so that we can kind of, at the very least, we can add the connectors for our oil and fuel pressure sensor. We're still waiting on the intake air temperature sensor, so depending on where we get in this video, we'll either include that or we'll show it in the next one. Alright, so now that we have all our lengths of wire figured out, what we're going to do is I have both the connectors for the sensors here. We're going to splice them in, heat shrink it all up, and call it done. And you can see right here I was talking about using a common power and a common ground for those sensors. So what I did was the main wire goes all the way to the further one, which is the oil pressure sensor, and then I teed off here with another one of those crimp connectors to go to the fuel pressure sensor. And we'll do the same thing here with the ground. You see I haven't crimped it yet, but same idea. And then we'll be all set with the sensor wiring. So another quick update, we have one of these connectors spliced in. So you can see this is actually the one that's been teed off the original lines way back here. So now all we need to do is connect the second sensor, and the engine harness is essentially complete. We will have to repin this with our Deutsch connector, but we'll probably wait till the very end with that just to make sure that we have everything included. Okay, so this is the final product. We have our oil and fuel pressure sensors wired in. And really that's where we're going to end it for today because we don't have all the materials we need to finish this up. Alright, thank you for everyone for tuning in. I really appreciate the support as our channel continues to grow and our content hopefully is improving with all the feedback we've been getting. Just for a review, what we did today was we opened up our Subaru engine harness. We figured out all the pinouts so that we can match it to our Megasport MS3Pro EVO computer with the universal harness. So we created our pinout. We have it here. And what the other thing we've done is we've spliced in our sensors for both our oil and fuel pressure, as well as created our leads for when we have our intake air temperature sensor to wire that in as well. So in the next video, to finish up the wiring, we're going to do our bulkhead connector with Deutsch connectors to connect the engine harness to the universal harness. We're going to wire in our fuel pump relay, and we're going to wire in our 2 relays for the 2 radiator fans. We really appreciate everyone being patient with kind of our the delay in some of our content. Unfortunately, with the COVID-19 and everything going on, it's been a little hard to get some of these last-minute parts to finish up our wiring project, which inevitably needs to be done for us to get the first start on the car. So as always, thanks for tuning in. Hit the subscribe button if you aren't already. Make sure you share with your friends and leave a comment below. Hope to see you again soon.